Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto have find the girl of his dreams dishing up ramen at the wrong end of an alley in the middle of the night part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. The bowl of steaming ramen flashing in green and red neon from the side of the building signaled the best possible escape route. Eyeing the narrow, tightly packed alley beneath the sign, Naruto tugged his dark gray hoodie farther over his head and turned in, disappearing into the crowd of shoppers and eaters out enjoying the night market. He shoved his hands into his pockets, brushing past the small folded parcel nestled there, hunched his shoulders and moved on quickly. He figured he was only steps ahead of them. A trio of men appeared suddenly in front of him, a wall of sharp black suits blocking the front of the first ramen stand. Naruto froze automatically, eyes darting over black jackets in front of him. What were they doing here? But the first suit belched loudly. Then the other two burst into laughter. Naruto angled up a quick glance up to see 3 salary men, letting loose for the night. They hooted with laughter, red-faced with food and drink, and parted around Naruto like a stream, never even noticing him. Together again, they jostled deeper into the tightly packed lane. The first one burped again, rubbed his belly and announced he was ready to take another bite out of Ramen Alley. As they aimed for door of another noodle shop, Naruto let his shoulders drop a notch in relief and kept going. But he'd only passed one more restaurant when a ruckus erupted from the mouth of crowded the alley. A rush of men, half a dozen, all in blue uniforms, dashed past. He didn't have to turn back to know who it was, and who they were looking for. Under the shade of his hood a smug smile touched his lips. He'd outwitted the Konoha police plenty of times. They didn't scare him. Ducking deeper under his hood, Naruto picked up the pace and wound farther down the narrowing alley. The restaurants grew shabbier and the clog of eaters thinned out. Empty food containers piled beside overfull trash cans. A strip of opaque sky drifted far above towering apartment buildings, nearly hidden beyond laundry lines and electrical wires. The lane narrowed down to a mere strip only wide enough for 2 or 3 people. The flashing signs above each door overlapped one another, rendering them useless. The ramen shops here were mere closets of space, wide enough only for a few barstools and a squat little kitchen. Garish menu posters ate up precious wall space and lined each propped open door, desperately enticing the hungry shopper who had strayed too far down. This way, I think I see him. Naruto stopped at an open door and pretended to read one of the garish pink menus taped there. Instead he watched the metal siding of the glass door. Reflected there was the silhouette of a lone police officer, looking hard down the alley and scanning the crowd. 2 more appeared at his side. They pointed toward the deepest part of Ramen Alley, towards him, then began pushing in against the flow of shoppers. Naruto swore to himself and quick-stepped around the door. He stopped and watched their progress through a gap in the menus. Halfway down the alley, the uniformed men descended upon another dark hooded eater, pulling him out into the street and jerking back his hood. A brown-haired kid with thick glasses slurped in a mouthful of noodles, loudly declaring his innocence around his food. The 3 sharp-suited men on the stools beyond him exploded into laughter. The joke spread through the restaurant and spilled out into the street. Apparently the Konoha police had caught the wrong guy. The energy was sucked out of the search. Pushing the kid back to his food amid the laughter, the officers stood looking angrily at patrons and shop owners alike, maybe hoping to find some other trouble to apprehend so they didn't come back empty-handed. Another policeman waved from the mouth of the alley, summoning them back. Then they were gone. Naruto let go of the breath he didn't realize he was holding. It clouded the glass between the menus. Now all he needed to do was deliver the package and... Oi, you just going to stand there looking at the menu or you gonna order something? Naruto turned slowly, surprised to hear a female voice snapping at him. Behind the counter stood a slip of a girl, glaring thunderously at him, one hand balled at her waist, the other holding a big metal ladle that jutted away from her. Naruto couldn't help but stare. It was usually burly, greasy old men who ran dives like these. But this was a girl. A rather pretty girl. With her bright green eyes and heart-shaped face, she looked more like one of the city girls who traveled in packs through the night market, smelling of perfume as they passed. Not cooking noodles. Her head was wrapped in a traditional bandana, confirming that she was in fact the ramen cook, not just a pretty face helping out. The front of the once white bandana was stained gray from years of use, just like any other hardworking man behind the pots on Ramen Alley. But under the tightly tied knot at the back, a fringe of bright pink hair fanned out over the smooth skin of her neck. She was young, probably around 20, no older than him. "Well, you going to order something or not?" she snapped, a delicate eyebrow arching. "I haven't got all night." The corner of Naruto's mouth twitched at the contradiction in her demand. Yes, in fact, she did have all night. She worked here, didn't she? She tapped the ladle on her aproned hip as she waited, pinning him with her green gaze. Strangely, he found the spark of anger in her features only made her more attractive. Naruto inhaled the warm air of the tiny shop. Ramen Alley always smelled as stale as an empty noodle carton. But in here the fragrance of broth and cooked meat was heady. The smell coated his tongue and made his stomach growl. Tendrils of steam rose from the behind the counter and worked like fingers on him, unhitching the tension in his chest and beckoning him closer. Naruto found himself very tempted to stay. After all, Konoha police never pursued anyone this far down the crowded alleys. He'd given them the slip, so he knew he was safe. And he was hungry. So why not? Just this one time he'd break his own rule about finishing the job and stay. Just for one bowl. His stomach growled suddenly, as if sharing its opinion too. He dipped his hand into his pocket, passed the folded package he was supposed to be delivering, and fingered through the folded bills at the bottom. He certainly had enough money. So with one more look into those green eyes, Naruto took the stool in front of the pretty cook and her rattling pots and pointed to the picture of pork ramen. His stomach rumbled again. Extra pork. Without a word the girl began dishing up the meal. Elbows propped on the counter, fingers interlaced in front of his mouth, Naruto watched her from the shadow of his hood as she worked. She set water to boil, doused the noodles, ladled broth and cranked up the heat under the fry pan with as much familiarity as any cook in the alley, even though she looked like she should be out sailing along the broad lanes, shopping bags swinging from her pale arms. He studied what he could see of her behind the bar. The apron nipped in at her waist, hinting at a girlish figure hidden beneath the dingy white work clothes. But he guessed she was more athletic than curvy. She hefted pots from burner to burner like she'd been doing it for years. She stopped for a moment, checking the firmness of the noodles, then shot her patron a rebuking look for staring. But Naruto wasn't chastened. He continued tracking her movements, thinking how her eyes looked amazingly green against her pale skin and gray clothes. The sweep of dark eyelashes against her cheeks only accentuated them. Then she was moving again, searing pork slices in the pan and yanking trays of toppings from a cooler before she kicking it closed with a foot. A small black and white television flickered from a high corner shelf, droning on about a local politician. Without looking up, she smacked the volume knob with her hand, silencing it. More than just a third-rate ramen cook, she was as quick and dexterous as any of the old grannies in the night market stalls, slinging several dishes at once. But to Naruto she was an anomaly. She turned back and was suddenly right in front of him, pork sizzling deep in the empty ramen bowl. She plucked lids off the rattling pots all while balancing the bowl in her hand and leaned over to check the contents. Steam left a fine mist on her forehead, but she was satisfied. She swiped her face dry with the crook of her arm, scooped out a serving of noodles, then plunged the ladle into the boiling broth. Naruto heard a small, unladylike grunt when a spray of hot liquid hit tips of her fingers. She may look like a society girl, he thought, but this is what she does for a living. He wondered how she came to be dishing out ramen at the wrong end of a dark alley in the middle of the night. A perfect steaming bowl of ramen was plunked down on the counter in front of him. She hoisted up the fry pan and slid another helping of pork on top, nestled among egg slices, chives and bamboo shoots. Finished, she tipped her head to the side and watched him coolly, waiting. Naruto fished out his money and laid it on the counter. Only after she'd collected the money up did she slide the bowl across. Must be a tough place, he laughed inwardly as he scooted the bowl directly in front of him. But all other thoughts were quickly erased by the waves of steam that were wafting up, enticing him. Naruto snapped his chopsticks, stomach growling impatiently, and inhaled his first bite. He breathed in broth and sucked down noodles in a single delicious slurp. It was heavenly. He took another bite, less greedy than the first, and savored more. Naruto. He looked up in stricken surprise. How did she know my name? You want some, she said slowly, as if speaking to a child. When he still didn't answer, she rolled her eyes and shook her head and lifted something at the edge of the counter. It was only then that he saw the plate of pink and white fish cakes she was angling up at him. He grimaced at the food and his mistake, and refused with a jerk of his head. He dipped back to his bowl, and she shrugged, leaving him alone. He never ate that stuff. Ever. It was bad enough he was named after it. After enduring a childhood of taunting, it seemed like it was fate's cruel joke to make him enjoy ramen so much. But this, he breathed in another waft of steam from the bowl, was much better than he'd had in a long, long time. He swirled his chopsticks, and slurped up another mouthful. In fact, he couldn't remember the last time he'd had anything other than instant noodles. Must have been at the orphanage. And that was years ago. Naruto's eyes drifted to the pretty cook again as he ate. She was busy ladling out broth and stuffing cartons, even though there was no one else ordering. He swirled up another mouthful, idly wondering just why he'd felt compelled to stay and eat. There was nothing special here. In fact, it was the very type of place he'd go a mile just to avoid. Bright pink menus were tacked to every surface, full of garish pictures of over-glossed food and endlessly shedding cherry branches. Sakura Ramen was emblazoned across the top of each one. The girl leaned into the small cooler, rummaging through plates of toppings. Some of her hair had escaped its knot and stuck to her neck in sweaty pink streaks. Naruto wondered darkly if her hair was part of some grand marketing scheme. It almost matched the pink on the menus. If he squinted, he chuckled to himself and slurped up another bite, enjoying the warm tang of the broth and the rubbery burst of the noodles, and feeling more full than he'd felt in, well, years. He didn't know a fresh meal could be so good. The cook came back up to the counter. Maybe she was going to throw him out for not eating fast enough, he thought with a smirk. But he didn't look up to find out. Hood still deep over his head, greedily cupping the delicious steam, Naruto watched her hands move on the other side of the counter. She fidgeted with her apron, checked her wristwatch, then opened the pots, jangling a ladle in a nearly empty one. Swirling the handle, she produced one more scoop of golden broth and noodles, and to Naruto's surprise she dashed it into his bowl between bites. He glanced up quizzically. On the house. It'll go to waste otherwise. Might as well someone eat it. Naruto shook his head at how she'd somehow taken the niceness out of what might have been a kind gesture. But he didn't refuse it. And she didn't seem to care. She turned quickly away, but instead of fixing up another pot, she took off her apron and flung it over a stack of textbooks on a low table behind the counter. Then she scooped up the sack of cartons she'd just prepared and disappeared through the back of the kitchen, propping the door open as she went. Naruto bent back to his ramen, perfectly satisfied to eat without distraction. It wasn't long though before another customer entered the shop. Without moving, Naruto glanced at the reflection in a small glass-fronted refrigerator. It was dingy, but he could still see two boys, hovering just inside the door beside a cheap ceramic umbrella stand, pretending to look at the menus plastered on the wall. He took another slow slurp of noodles. They looked to be about 12, just old enough to get into trouble. One black-headed, one blonde. The boys nervously glanced from Naruto to the empty kitchen, whispering between them. But, she's gone, the blonde whined. Doesn't matter. Somebody's eating. Too risky. Eyes never leaving Naruto's back, The dark-haired kid tore a paper menu off the door and shoved it in his pocket as if that were his reason for coming there, then sauntered out of the store, followed by his friend. Outside, however, they took off at a run. Naruto laughed softly and tucked back into his ramen. He knew thieves when he saw them. And those kids were probably hoping to grab whatever they could from behind the counter while she was gone. That cute cook must leave every night at this time. He shook his head at her mistake. Following the same routine made it much easier for kids like that, and men like him, to take whatever they wanted. But since the food was so damn good, he was glad he was there. She gave him a second helping, and he was around to keep the money in her drawer. Well, for one more night at least. So they were even. Those boys could have been him and Sasuke. He remembered that age, being a young nothing with too much anger and too much time. He and Sasuke raised hell for a while when they were 12 and 13. But at 14, everything changed. Swirling his chopsticks slowly through the last of the broth, Naruto frowned at the memories. That was 6 long years ago. A door scraped shut in the back of the kitchen. The girl came back, scanning everything. Everything okay? Naruto caught the double meaning. Watching her scan the shop for anything missing, then looking back to his food, as if that's what she was concerned about, he realized she had given him another bowl so she could sneak out the back for a few minutes. He hitched his eyebrows, a little impressed that she was so crafty, but also that she was so foolish as to rely on someone like him to babysit her shop. Naruto sat back, wiping his mouth with his napkin, and looked at her. He thought about pulling back his hood and showing her what he really was. But he didn't want to rewrite her pretty features with fear. Instead, he found he rather liked being the subject of her softening, expectant gaze. She was very pretty, actually. And she had apparently sized him up and decided he was trustworthy. She was wrong, of course, but the implied flattery, her striking green eyes, and those 2 bowls of ramen must have gotten to him. Couple kids came in, he began. She narrowed her eyes knowingly, confirming to Naruto that she knew what those kids were about. They seemed to know you'd be gone. I'd watch out for them if I were you. She slipped back into the huff she had been in when he first walked in, and drummed her fingers on her hip. Perhaps she was expecting those kids and not an actual customer. He didn't know why he felt compelled to go on, but he did. You should change up your schedule. Never do the same thing twice. Makes it harder for them too. His voice thinned out. She was already rolling her eyes as if she didn't need him explaining it. Yeah, thanks. Sarcasm laced her voice. Of course, he thought, nearly rolling his eyes. She'd be no one's fool. He stood, the corner of his mouth curving up at the thought that this girl was just as hardened as any of the old grannies in the night market too. The ones he knew never to steal from because they'd beat you with whatever was within arm's reach if they caught you. Not that they ever caught him, of course. Still, she sure didn't look like one of the old ladies at the market. The saucy curl of her lips as she smirked at him and told him to have a good one, and the bounce of her hip as she turned was unmistakably girlish. And it had the same warming effect as the ramen did, it left him wanting a little more. At the door, Naruto glanced back. She had picked up her apron and was just flipping open the top book in the big stack. He shoved his hand in his pocket, rustling the parcel that still needed to be delivered, and turned down the darkening alley. He felt full and content. Energized. Which was good. It was just after midnight, and he still had a long night ahead of him. The red cigarette tip-in hovering in the dark was the only sign that Naruto's 2 contacts were waiting for him at the end of the alley. He didn't know why he was meeting them at the back door of a video game parlor, but he didn't ask questions. He just delivered the goods. He scuffed over a flattened box he couldn't see, the edge nearly tripping him. It was so dark they wouldn't even be able to inspect their treasure. But that didn't matter. They knew he was good for it. No words were spoken. The cigarette glowed bright with a long inhale, then the shadowy figure in front opened the palm of his hand. Naruto passed over the parcel. Upon hearing the rustle of paper, the man in back stepped forward and clicked on a pen light, shining a spotlight down. They all leaned in to admire a carved jade kimono hook nestled in white tissue paper. A magnificent dragon swooped over on itself in an elegant S shape. Its tail arced out to form the hook that would have held together the kimono of an old Konoha ruler. Under the light it gleamed like brand new. But the hook was almost 400 years old, or so Naruto had heard. Naruto hadn't gotten a good look at it when he'd slid it out of its case and into his pocket. The tissue paper was to make sure he didn't touch anything. But now it made the old trinket look like a gift, and in the dark Naruto felt a little whiff of pride at lifting such a beautiful object. He didn't know much about art or history, but even he had to admit there was something beautiful about it. No wonder it was so valuable. It looked alive. The man sniffed and pocketed the hook as thoughtlessly as if it were his cigarette lighter. The penlight clicked off. You need to go back again. We need one more item. What? Why? I got what you asked. Shish. His partner snapped from the steps behind him. It won't be a surprise visit if we give ourselves away. What are you doing back here anyway? Naruto rejoined in a whisper, wrinkling his nose at the smell from trash and fetid water. They're holding out on us, his contact said quietly. Nightly receipts. We're here to make it right. The red-tipped cigarette glowed again. We need you to go back and get the other one too. The one beside it. The jade disc. Why? Because he wants the other piece too, that's why. What's the matter? This shouldn't be a problem for you. It's not. It's just that. Did you get into any trouble? No. Good. I already told you about the 3 guards. The guards were no sweat, Naruto said. And it was true. The 3 thick-necked security guards had been easy to outwit, although he skipped over the heart-stopping moment when he thought he saw them again in Ramen Alley. But, I was chased by the cops. What? The cigarette jumped dangerously in the dark. The man behind him snorted a soft laugh. Wasn't my fault. There was a big robbery up on the high street. Smashed windows, yellow tape, police everywhere. I walked right into it. Guess I fit their description cause they stayed on me for longer than usual. He gave a nervous laugh. But I lost him down past the market. What did you go up that way for? I told you to go around the long way, down by the wharf. Naruto tried to act nonchalant, but he breathed in the smoky air and coughed. Bad info. I'd heard it was clear. Thought I'd save some time going the shorter route. This earned him another contemptuous snort. Who told you that? Somebody that must have had it out for you if that's the info they gave you. Naruto slid his eyes away, looking guilty, and the shadow jumped forward and shoved him hard. What did you listen to him for? I've told you not to trust a thing he says. Probably screwing you over to get to me. That whack job. His partner grabbed his jacket and hauled him back, whispering harshly, Geez, let it go already. You're going to give us away. He shook off his partner's grasp, but still lowered his voice. I'm not gonna let it go. Next time he says anything to you, come clear it by me first. Got it? Naruto rubbed his shoulder. Yeah, alright, he said quietly. When do you need it by? Tomorrow. Mon, Naruto whined. Is that a problem? No, Naruto answered darkly. I was just hoping I could have a little time before going back. You know, let things cool off. Nope. The shadow stamped out his cigarette. And it's best to do it now, before they have time to figure out the first piece is gone. If they move the other one, we might never get it. Naruto nodded begrudgingly. A wedge of yellow light cracked through the darkness and the obnoxious sounds of a plinko parlor spilled into the alley. An old woman in an faded smock peered out suspiciously. Pockets sagging with change and receipts, the woman squinted unseeing into the dark while the tinny sounds of digital cheers and falling coins crashed out around her. Naruto automatically ducked his head to keep his face in shadow. Finally focusing on the 2 men, she straightened, bowed quickly then urged them in. Tomorrow night, Naruto heard the man say from the door. Bring it to me, same time. Come to the club. Then the door slammed, a heavy lock slid into place and Naruto was alone in the still, dark alley. He sighed and sunk his hands into his empty pocket. It was only a few hours till daylight. He needed to sleep, then come up with a whole new strategy. 18 hours later, he still had no new plan. So he fell back on the old one. It was straightforward, a grab and dash job, but if they didn't know anything had been taken yet, it would still work. Deep inside the walled historic district of Old Konoha, Naruto squatted in the shadow of a perfectly round shrub outside an open kitchen door. It was just the right angle to peer up into the kitchen. He knew because he'd been frequenting this spot for the better part of 2 weeks. He checked his watch. 10:20 p.m. A woman stood at the sink, humming to herself as she washed the rest of dinner's dishes. Another housekeeper came in with a stack of small plates and teacups, set it on the counter and sat down to share some gossip. They were completely at ease. Naruto was certain they didn't know their household was a little bit lighter this evening, having lost one jade hook to him the night before. These old clan families, tucked away in their perfect homes, safe behind old Konoha's walls, they probably didn't even care about those ancient pieces of junk, he told himself. It was just a status symbol, like everything else in their walled compounds. Sprawling historical houses and sweeping gardens, complete with servants and gardeners. Some houses offered tours of their oldest buildings, putting their family treasures on display. But some, like this compound, employed security guards to ward off an imagined onslaught, as if some warring army was hiding beyond their wall, ready to strike at any time. Naruto snorted. Like anything bad ever happened here. Old Konoha was like a lazy old samurai, content to grow fat on the glories of the past. The poverty, hardships and crime of modern life had long been pushed outside of their faded walls. And then they'd close the gates. The only way you made a living in here was if you have the right clan name. Naruto knew where he belonged. And it wasn't in here. The running water suddenly turned off. There was a scrape of a chair and the clink of lifting plates, and then the voices drifted into the other room. Naruto looked at his watch. 10:30. They were putting away the dishes in the dining room. This was it. Naruto hopped up and crept silently through the kitchen and out the long wide hall, making sure to duck under the open windows. Once past, he ran down the length of the polished wood floor to the clan's scroll room. It was so easy. They had no idea. In fact, he was so confident that he already felt the familiar buzz coming on, the same light feeling he had when was younger and he picked off something good from one of the night market stalls. Like a bowl of noodle soup, still piping hot, swiped from the back counter while the unlucky shopper was paying for it. Naruto bit down a grin. He had to focus. This was the part where he felt like a ninja in one of his childhood books. He peered into the room, checking the most obvious hiding spots before he entered. Once he was inside a room, it could become a trap if he wasn't careful. He counted his possible escape routes and watched for any sign of movement. But this room was empty. No shadows in the corners, no lines of light blocked. No movement in the air. The room was still dusty and untouched, convincing Naruto he was the last one to come through here in months. He crossed the room, passing displays of old scrolls whose writings were a mystery to him, to a small glass case laid out on the table in the center. He pulled a piece of tissue paper out of his pocket and used it to cup the edge of the glass case. On one side of a black velvet pillow was the indention where the dragon hook had laid. Next to it was a disc carved with a matching design in the flat side of the stone. An ornate dragon rolled and tumbled in a perpetual circle around the milky green surface. He scooped up the disc, lowered the lid, and folded the trinket into the paper. It fit nicely into the palm of his hand. Even through the paper he could feel its edges were smooth with years of use at the end of a kimono sash. When it was safely in his pocket, he checked the room one more time and walked silently back to the door. The night air was warm, crickets were chirping and the sound of water filtered in from the garden. The open door framed a beautiful picture of the walled garden beyond, with its winding paths, flowing streams and exotic trees that stretched their long green limbs above the manicured garden. He had to admit, this was the good life. A sudden creak rent the air and Naruto's heart leapt to his throat. A shadow fell across the wooden boards outside the door. Someone was coming. Naruto dashed across the room to his best escape route and threw back a screened window. He flung his legs over the ledge and looked back to see if he'd been caught, just as the shadow drifted away again. Must have been a servant. He blew out a breath and decided to cut around through the garden to get back to the kitchen gate, just to be safe. He jumped, but the moment his feet thudded to the ground, the air erupted with shouts. Shig! Over here! He jumped out the back. Naruto shot off into a run when the two thick-necked guards barreled out from the corners of the house. The third, Shig, the biggest of them, came pounding off the porch where he'd been waiting for Naruto. Naruto ran through the garden, leaping streams and dodging arranged boulders. The kitchen gate route was cut off. Now all that was left was to hope he could find a door somewhere along the back wall. Naruto cursed himself as he jumped a low hedge for not casing the garden as well as the house. Up ahead the wall was looming and he was eating up ground without finding an exit. He scanned desperately. The walls were too high to scale and there was nothing tall enough or close enough to give him a leg up. Ahead, the shadow of a shrub fell across the wall in a strange way. He didn't know if it was a gate, but he'd have to chance it. The men were hard on his heels, their panting coming closer. An arm shot from behind the shrub and snapped Naruto's neck backwards. All forward momentum stopped in one jarring second. His vision spun as the biggest man stepped out of a hidden path and hoisted him up by the back of his neck. Caught you this time, you little punk. He flung Naruto into the widest part of the gravel where several other paths intersected and where the other two men stood, panting hard. As soon as he hit the ground, Naruto ignored the deep scrapes to his hands from the gravel and scrambled up to run. But they surrounded him. These men were big. Bigger than Naruto realized. Their black suits wore a layer of dust from the chase and their hair was knotted at the top as if they were sumo wrestlers. Or sumo in training. But no wrestler he'd ever known of would work at something as menial as a security guard. Sumo or not, it didn't matter. These men were huge. Their hands alone were like catcher's mitts. They didn't carry weapons, and they didn't need to. Their hands did the work. And right now, they were aimed at Naruto. He watched all three with fear coiling in his stomach. This was bad. Very bad. The biggest one popped his knuckles menacingly. Show us what you've got in your pocket, kid, and maybe we won't break all your bones. The others laughed, egging him on. Yeah, you tell him, Shigeru. Naruto laughed nervously from the ground, trying to think fast and failing. Nothing. I was just. A kick to the gut silenced him. Naruto curled in on himself, covering his face and trying hard just to breath, as hands tugged at his coat and pants pocket. When he cracked his fingers and looked up, Shigeru was bouncing the jade circle in his hand, smiling. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, he slid the disc into his pants pocket. Let's have a little fun before we call the cops. They dragged Naruto to his feet and pushed him between themselves, landing blow after blow to his gut, his chest and back of the head, laughing wildly and booting him as he went past, until Naruto was dizzy and grunting with each blow. He stumbled to his knees. The worst of it was he knew that getting beaten up would be just the start of his problems. He'd lost the loot, and there would be a punishment for it, worse than getting roughed up by thugs or even being thrown in jail for a night. Someone hauled him back up by his collar, and before Naruto could get his bearings, Shigeru's meaty fist was arcing into his face. It caught him above the eye, knocking him backwards. Naruto blacked out as he fell, and only the jarring blow of his head against gravel brought him around again. He instinctively curled on his side. His vision blurred and his ears rang and something wet was running down the side of his face. Naruto reached a shaky hand up to touch the throbbing spot on his forehead, but beyond the curve of his hand he saw Shigeru pat his pocket. He was checking that the jade disc was still there. Before Naruto's fingers reached the wound, he curled his hand into a fist. This wasn't over yet. He could still finish the job. He pushed himself slowly off the ground, blood leaking into the corner of his eye, but he stayed focused on his goal. Shigeru laughed as Naruto struggled to stand. The other two closed in, ready to take him down, but Shigeru waved them off. That last one should have knocked him out. Tough little runt, you wanna feel some real pain then. Shigeru pulled out a set of brass knuckles from the other pocket, slid them on and grinned. Come at me, kid. This won't take long. Naruto lurched forward with a weak punch. Shigeru swung, a streak of gold whizzing at Naruto's nose, but Naruto ducked and threw himself at Shigeru's broad chest. Naruto clung to his jacket, clutching and falling as if he really did have the wits knocked out of him. Shigeru swung again, but Naruto was too close and too slippery. While Shigeru fought to grab hold of him, Naruto dipped his hand into the pants pocket, hooked a finger through the cool disc, yanked it out and flipped it into the hollow of his palm. It only took a few seconds, but it was enough time for Shigeru to regain control. He clamped his huge hand down on Naruto's shoulder and sent Naruto flying. Flung down the path, Naruto rolled and rolled, as limp as a rag. When he finally came to a stop, he was nearly at the far wall of the compound. Gravel was in his shoes, his hoodie was twisted around his neck and the sky was spinning. But tight in his palm was the cool, smooth circle. He still had it. Naruto moved quickly, pocketing the disc as the sound of footsteps pounded closer. Now he just had to get out of here. Scrambling onto all fours, ears ringing, and a pounding headache starting above his left eye, Naruto swung his gaze around the garden. The three wrestler guards were closing in. One popped his knuckles, the other popped his elbow, and Shigeru stalked down the middle of the path. He rolled his fingers in the brass knuckles, then spread his huge palms out to each side to catch Naruto if he ran for the house. Nostrils flaring, he looked like he wanted to pound Naruto right into the ground. Naruto bet Shigeru would be moving a lot faster if he knew his pockets were empty. And he didn't want to stick around when they discovered he'd pulled one over on them. Again. Naruto sucked in a breath, dug his fingers into the gravel and sized them up. One was shorter than the rest. That was his man. Naruto needed someone closer to his size if his plan was going to work. He lunged for the short one and the other two were instantly on his heels. The man swung and Naruto tried to block it, but it still knocked him sideways. But when the guy closed in for another blow, Naruto threw a handful of dust and gravel up into his face. The man's punch collapsed into pawing at his own face and cursing viciously. Naruto ducked past him and tore out across the garden. The two men took off after him with the third stumbling behind, blinking tears. Get him. Naruto thought he might be able to make it back to the open kitchen gate, but the sounds of a scuffle had the whole house on high alert. Lights flickered from the back of the house and reflected in the koi pond, and voices were already calling out in alarm. Can't go that way. Naruto veered off, leaping over shrubs and knocking down a stone lantern, skidded across the path and sprinted toward his only option left. Somehow he had to get over that high garden wall. Halfway down the long side wall, a manicured tree raised limbs like green cloud puffs up and over the edge. It was close enough that if he climbed it, he could jump. It was his only option. He went straight for it, hoping the delicate tree would hold him. Naruto scrambled up the trunk as Shigeru huffed through the bushes behind him. Naruto climbed faster. The top of the wall was in sight when the limbs turned thin and began to creak under his fingers. But he kept going. Shigeru swatted back at the other men. Go around to the other side. He pitched his jacket over a shrub, rolled up his sleeves and started up the tree. It shook ominously with each step. Naruto pulled himself onto the last branch that would support him. It arched toward the wall, but not nearly close enough. He'd have to jump. But when he stepped out, the branch cracked under his unsteady feet. He eased back, heart pounding in his ears. Gripping the trunk behind him, Naruto looked down. Shigeru was hoisting himself up with a broad mean grin, like he knew there was no way out but down. And Naruto had a sinking feeling he might be right. Naruto gulped a last breath, shoved off from the trunk and took a running leap. Pushing hard, the branch snapped under Naruto's feet and he flailed ungracefully at the wall, praying in that split second that his forward momentum was enough. Naruto hit the wall with an oomph. His fingertips were just high enough to scrape over the top of the ledge and grab hold. The branch flung back and hit the Shigeru in the face, knocking him out of the tree. Gasping to get air back into his lungs, Naruto pulled hard, towed his way up the wall and threw himself over. He hit the ground hard on the other side and found himself in the middle of a dark lane. It was no more than a long stone corridor broken only by the occasional locked door leading to another clan compound and another hidden garden. There was nowhere to hide. The two men exploded out of the nearest door. There he is. They tore down the pavement toward Naruto, who, still heaving from the wall, pushed himself off the ground and ran like his life depended on it. He didn't know where he was going or even how he'd get out of there. He just knew he had to keep running and hope he didn't hit a dead end. The men proved to be smarter than he anticipated. Jackets flying, they ran fast and stayed together, keeping up with Naruto as he tore down old Konoha's twisting narrow lanes. But at some point they split off. Naruto's heart almost stopped when he glanced back and saw only one guy. They'd made a plan. Their better knowledge of the streets meant one of them could head him off. Now he watched ahead and behind. Sure enough, just when the walled alley opened up onto a broad avenue lined with shops and alleys and places to hide, and Naruto thought he'd finally made it, the other guy came barreling around the corner. His arms were stretched out and hands open, ready to grab Naruto. Naruto lunged sideways, missing by scant inches the fingers that swiped at his neck, and stumbled over a curb. The two men were back on him, closer than ever. He turned onto the avenue and ran down the crowded sidewalk, something he would never have done if he wasn't desperate. All it would take would be one police officer, one security guard, one shop owner reporting a ruckus, and it was all over. Just ahead of him, an old man was wheeling his cart back in before locking up his shop for the night. Naruto felt a little guilty, but this was exactly what he needed. Running, he dodged the cart, but shoved hard as he went past, causing it to teeter and fall over, spilling the old man's produce all over the sidewalk. Hey, you can't do that. Come back here. It slowed the two men by just a hair. But it was enough. Naruto was able to duck into the darkness of an alley 2 blocks down and lose the panting men. Then he slipped out through the faded red gates of old Konoha and into the flashing lights, honking cars and tangled mess of Konoha's modern streets. Threading between the cheap apartment buildings, beneath dripping air conditioning units and strings of laundry, Naruto disappeared into the dark narrow lanes of Konoha. Finally, he knew he was safe. This was his world, and they'd never find him here. Naruto breathed in deeply and walked slower, still keeping to the shadowed shortcuts he knew well, but letting himself relax. He sunk his hand into the pocket of his pants. A brilliant grin broke across on his face. The jade disc was still there. He'd done it. He felt light, like his feet were floating a little with each step. This had to be one of the best lifts he'd ever pulled. Not the easiest, not by a long shot, but the luckiest at least. Stealing it, then pickpocketing it back again, escaping that Shigeru dude, then outrunning his buddies. Another grin touched his lips at the thought of retelling this adventure at the club. He ought to head over there right now, even though he was early. But skirting the edge of the night market, a waft of cooking food hit him. His stomach growled. Then his smile turned warm. There was enough time to grab a bite to eat before he turned it in. And he knew just where to go. The girl behind the counter spun around and instantly frowned at him. Her eyes darted to a wristwatch clutched in her hand. 2 white bags sat behind her on the cooler, their tops folded over and their sides filled out with square takeout boxes, ready to be delivered. Naruto glanced down, stifling a laugh. She was just as cute as the night before, even if she looked like having a paying customer walk into an otherwise empty restaurant was somehow an intrusion. He didn't care. It was a good night. He'd have fresh ramen and ponder the mystery of that girl. The thought of a warm meal in her cool green eyes was already filling him with delicious anticipation. She worked fast, dishing up a bowl of ramen and setting it on the counter while he was still fishing out a few bills. He didn't notice when she pulled a plate up from behind the counter. Wait. Not Naruto, right? Naruto's momentary panic quickly gave way to confusion, then he saw the plate of pink and white fish cakes and understood. He couldn't help but laugh. Yeah, that's right. She slid the bowl over and he reached out to take it, only realizing just how bad his hands looked in the light. His knuckles were bloody and the back of his hands were scraped up and covered with dirt. It must have hurt when it happened, but he couldn't remember exactly when. In the rush of escaping, he'd simply forgotten. Did you get in a fight? Naruto jerked his hands back suddenly. No, mugged. The lie came easily. He tightened his fists, testing them and discovering his hands were really sore. Knowing what they looked like only made them hurt worse. He gingerly reached for the chopsticks when the pretty cook leaned over to look under his hood before he could duck away. Is that blood? She peered into his face. Hey, you're really hurt, aren't you? Naruto brushed flakes of dried blood off his cheek, as surprised as she was. His fingers trailed up to his eyebrow, which was now as tender as a bruised peach, and found a big, sticky gash there. Huh, he said softly. He'd forgotten that the big guy had hit him. Didn't matter. He'd take care of it later. You say you got mugged. The girl's voice came from behind the counter. The steam from the bowl rose up to meet him, and his stomach growled as if responding. Yeah, he said, distracted by his hunger. He picked up the chopsticks again, just to get in one bite. Do you want me to look at it for you? Wah. Chopsticks frozen over the bowl, he turned to the sound of her voice. She stood 2 stools down, holding the hinged counter up and looking at him expectantly. Just like the night before, it took him a moment to figure out what she meant. It's pretty bad. Someone ought to look at it. She jerked her head to an old chair behind the counter. I'm a medic, she said confidently. But when her green eyes roved the dingy noodle shop, her voice thinned. Well, I will be when I finish school. But I'm certified for first aid. Naruto set down his chopsticks, ignored his rumbling stomach and slid off the stool. Oh okay, sure. He wasn't exactly sure what she was offering, but in that moment whatever it was more tempting than the ramen. He ducked past the open counter and went where she pointed, a straight-back wooden chair she'd pulled away from the tiny desk, and sat down. He waited obediently while she pulled out a white plastic kit from a shelf, tore open a small packet and wiped her hands with an alcohol towelette. On the desk were the pile of books he'd seen the night before. Their spines spelled out a daunting study load: first aid, physical examinations and emergency care, the maternity to newborn handbook, elder care, a short course, math for meds, medical dosage calculations, principles of pediatric care, the Atlas of Human Anatomy, women's health across the lifespan, public health, population-based care for the whole community, and a diary of a field medic, my life on the front lines. He tipped his head to read the last one, free clinics, changing communities one life at a time, when his hood was suddenly yanked back from the top of his head. Naruto gasped, but his hands weren't fast enough to stop her. The girl saw his wound first, but her eyes instantly jumped to his cheek, right to the marks he was always so careful to hide with his shaggy hair and his hood. 3 jagged lines tore down each cheek. Her face changed when she saw them. She was so close, he couldn't have missed it if he tried. Those pretty green eyes widened first in surprise, then alarm, and then all emotion was shuttered and she turned away. He'd seen it 1,000 times on the streets, before he stole a hoodie and learned only to reveal himself to others who were like him. Fear, then distrust, then ignoring him as if he were invisible. Or glaring at him as if to say he should stay with his own kind. The outcasts. The criminals. Naruto sighed softly, pulled up his hood and rose to leave. The pretty girl, the ramen. It was nice while it lasted. What are you doing? Sit down. She had a purple latex glove over one hand, a bottle of disinfectant and cotton balls in the other. And take your hood off. I can't clean it if I can't get to it. Her voice was as firm as if she gave out medical orders every day for her job, not cooking ramen. Naruto was stunned. He dropped back into the seat without a word, only remembering afterwards to pull back his hood. She dragged an old stool in front of him and proceeded to scrub away the dried blood and prod at the sore spot above his eyebrow. Naruto winced a few times. The spot felt raw and puffy, and from the amount of blood she wiped off, the gash must have been big. He didn't speak, and she didn't ask about his scars, but he knew she must have been curious, if not worried. I'm not a. He started, but stopped. What was he going to say? I'm not a thief. Not part of a gang. He was. I mean, I'm not going to. I'm not here to. I don't care, she said flatly. You have a serious injury that needs to be looked at. While she tended to his wound, he stole looks at her. Her green eyes were even prettier close up, her pale skin had a trace of freckles, her pink hair hid just past the edge of her neck where it was tied in her white cook's bandana. So what are you? She said after several minutes of silence. She dabbed from the alcohol bottle and wiped it above his eye. In a gang. Did you get in some kind of trouble with the law? The shock of cold alcohol, which was quickly beginning to burn, wasn't enough to stop him from automatically lying. No, not at all. She leaned back to look at him in the face, truly surprised. Really? Unexpected guilt pricked at him. But it only lasted as long as the time it took him to come up with a story. Run deliveries. Like a courier service. But at night. Yeah, this alley is a shortcut for me. And, your ramen always smelled so good, and I've always wanted to stop by, so. She sat back, lips parted in a silent laugh, and arched an eyebrow as if she didn't believe him. It was such a cute look that he smiled at her, forgetting to try to be convincing. This part of the alley stinks. And it's a shortcut to nowhere. I should know, she said ruefully, then stopped herself. She refocused on finishing cleaning the area around the wound. There was a creak of someone stepping over the threshold, but before she could stand, they both heard voices. She's not here. No, I don't think this is a good idea. Come on. Now's our chance. We should wait. She might be back. What are you afraid of? It's now or never. Naruto and the girl exchanged glances. It was the two kids from the night before. They were back again to try and steal from her. She swore silently, swiveled and reached for a ladle from behind the counter, but Naruto stopped her with a hand on her arm. Watch this, he whispered. He shot up from behind the counter with a deep roar. Hey, Wadiadoin. The same boys from the night before, one black-haired, one blonde, nearly jumped out of their skin. They spun around, ran into each other, lunged for the exit and missed, nearly toppling the cheap ceramic umbrella stand next to the door, then jammed together through the door to bolt off down the alley. Naruto turned back with a big grin. The corners of a smile hiding behind her fingers was worth it. Those kids, they're always trying to. Her smile froze. Her eyes went big. She jammed a hand in her pocket and pulled out an old wristwatch missing half its band. The kids. Oh no, I completely forgot. She grabbed the two takeout bags off the corner and was about to run out the back, when she remembered she wasn't exactly alone. I need to. She clutched the bags. They're waiting, and, it's just out the back, but I should lock up. Go. Naruto said quickly. I'll stay here. With a breathless, thanks, she dashed out. He sat back in the chair, laced his hands behind his head, kicked his feet out and smiled to himself. His quick thinking had gotten him out of several tight spots tonight. And he could thank that sumo wrestler turned security guard Shigeru for nearly knocking him out, because it got him closer to her. And that made him feel as high as he did making any good lift. Better even, because she wasn't some object he'd been told to steal. He wanted this all for himself. No one else even needed to know. But he did have to congratulate himself on that the line about the delivery boy. It was a stroke of genius. And the best part was that it was true. Well, mostly true. They told him what to get, and he delivered it. He didn't hurt anyone. But she seemed pretty straight-laced and no nonsense. He had the feeling she wouldn't be comfortable with knowing that side of his, delivery job. The back door opened and closed, and a lock slid into place. Naruto straightened. Thank you, she said earnestly when she walked back in. Someone comes to pick those bags up every night. I know, he said, smiling at her. She tipped her head, confused. Last night, he said. Those kids came in at the front door at the same time. They know your schedule. He stood, but she pointed firmly to the chair and said, I'm not finished yet, and he sat back down obediently. She reached into the top of the first aid kit and pulled out a butterfly bandage. Oh yeah, she said, remembering as she peeled off one wing of the bandage. That's right. You said I should change things, mix it up. Not make it so easy for someone to know my schedule. Naruto nodded, then leaned his head forward closer as she instructed. She pinched the laceration together, pressed the wings to either side of the cut and smoothed them down with her thumb. There. Now you won't have to get stitches. Really? It was that bad? He poked at his forehead above his left eye, feeling the small bandage in the middle of a dull throbbing area. Yeah, and now it probably won't scar either. Her hand stilled, as if she suddenly remembered something she'd forgotten. Naruto knew what it was. Unless you scar easily. She turned away and busied herself with throwing away the used items and tidying up the first aid kit, and Naruto looked down at his cut-up hands. She wanted to know more about his scars. Anyone would, and why not? They marked him as an outsider. Maybe she was hoping it was just an accident. I don't, he said quietly. Don't what? She asked over her shoulder. Scar easily, he answered, standing. She turned back to him, still holding the first aid kit. Oh, I see. They stood across from each other. He took in her heart-shaped face, so smooth and free of any marks. She was taller than he thought, now that they weren't separated by a counter. Maybe only few inches shorter, if they were standing closer. He sighed, deciding what, if anything, he should say. Then he would leave. I don't scar easily. These, he ghosted his fingers over his cheeks and tried to keep the edge out of his voice. I didn't do these. Oh, she said softly, blinking once. Yeah, he sighed. That's why I took this, night job. No one notices. So no one cares. She didn't say anything. She wasn't scared or disappointed or even impressed. It was as if he hadn't said anything at all. And instead of giving him the cold shoulder or asking him to leave her like every other shopkeeper in Konoha would have done, she just turned back and pushed the first aid kit and the supplies back on the shelf. Like it wasn't that big a deal. Like he was normal. You could always get surgery, get them reduced, she said with her back still turned. There are a lot of cosmetic surgeons in old Konoha. But it might cost you. Naruto lifted the counter and ducked under, considering her words. I never thought anything could be done for them, he said quietly. He didn't know of a doctor anywhere in Konoha that would let someone like him through the door. She would never know about that though. As pretty as she was. Any door in Konoha, old or new, would open for her. Thanks. Maybe I'll have someone take a look at them. Watching her, he felt a sudden urge to prove he was more than just his scars. You know, I do all right making deliveries, puffing his chest with the boast. Pretty good actually, he sniffed. I'm my own man now. He was going to create some elaborate story about how he could afford a doctor's visit if he really wanted to, but he didn't want to sound ungrateful for what she'd done for him. He needn't have worried though. She just shrugged at his words, already slipping back into ramen cook mode, and picked up a towel to wipe down the counter. She stopped when she noticed the uneaten bowl of ramen on the counter, now stone cold. You didn't get to eat your noodles. She reached for the cash drawer to refund his money, but he put his hands up, refusing it. You patched me up. We're even. Well, actually, she cut her eyes to the side and twisted the towel. It helped me out too, she admitted. I need to log several hours of community health assessments for my school program. So, she pointed to a spiral notebook at the back of the desk with, Konoha U, Healthcare Case Studies, written in big bold letters across the front. He laughed out loud. Wait, I'm just a lab rat. Her lips quirked at the corners, compelling him to keep going. He eyed her books on the table. So, Are you studying to be a nurse or something? A doctor, she said firmly. A field medic, actually. He nodded, impressed. But he still hoped to tease another smile out of her. Last time I checked, we weren't at war. She picked up the bowl and wiped down the counter where he'd briefly sat. A field medic to practice out here. Not just in a cushy office inside the wall. So these are the front lines then, Naruto said with a laugh, gesturing to the empty noodle shop. Yes, she said with a seriousness that surprised him. Well, not in here. But in the buildings around here. You'd be surprised how hard life is for them. There are a lot of kids, families and elderly here in these high-rise buildings. And none of them can afford medical care. And that's not all. The gangs, she stopped herself and went back her wiping, bowl still in her hand. You probably don't want to hear all of this. I do. He smiled at her. You're passionate about this, I can tell. She looked down at the counter again, embarrassed at herself, and shrugged one shoulder. She turned to take the bowl of uneaten ramen to the sink but stopped. You know, I can pack this to go for you. If you want to heat it up later. Naruto seriously considered taking it. But he wanted something else. And going without ramen for one night was just the opening he needed. Tell you what, he said stepping closer to the counter, dropping his voice a notch and smiling into her surprised face. I'll come back tomorrow, and you can make me some more. He nodded to the bowl before catching her eyes so she knew he was serious. Then you can tell me all about why you want to be a field medic. Are you working tomorrow? A corner of her mouth lifted up, followed by a pale pink bloom that rose in her cheeks. Yeah, she said softly. I'm here every night. He flashed his most charming grin. Then I'll see you tomorrow. It worked. A shy smile curved up her face, and the blush on her cheeks deepened. This time there was no snappy comeback or stern look. Instead, suddenly embarrassed, she wiped her hands on her apron and scrubbed a section of the counter she'd just finished cleaning, attacking a crack in the surface that looked older than she was. Watched her distracted frenzy and knowing he'd finally gotten to her, a light, fizzy feeling took hold, surprising him. It was the same way he felt after he finished a job. But this time, he hadn't taken anything, not really. More like he'd discovered it. She really was a girl after all, beneath that hard exterior of the tough night shift cook or the non-nonsense medic. A curl of pink hair fell loose from her bandana and trailed around her neck, and Naruto thought maybe he'd like to stay a little longer. But when he jammed his hand into his pocket, the cool jade nudged his fingertips as if reminding him he had someplace else to be. He sighed. At the door, he stopped, pulled up his hood and gingerly tapped his forehead. Thanks again, Doc. A laugh bubbled up before she could stop it, and she grinned down at the counter, shaking her head, refusing to look up or give him anything else but a sharp nod of goodbye. But it didn't matter. Her laugh and that secret smile that no one else saw went right through him. He went out the door, grinning big and walking on air. He knew he'd be back. Every night. Ramen or not. Next chapter. Chapter 3: The Night Market. Naruto skirted the clogged streets of the night market. At nearly 1 a.m. it still pulsed with sounds, smells and people. He turned down a dark lane lit by a single street lamp. The silhouettes of two men melted out of the shadows beside a lone door. The tip of a cigarette suddenly burned cherry red in the darkness. Naruto stepped off the sidewalk and walked down the middle of the empty lane toward a circle of light on the ground. The muscular guy seated on a stool beside the door didn't pay him any attention. But the smoker stepped forward into the lamplight. Cold light reflected off his long ponytail, making his pale hair almost glow white. Naruto snickered to himself in the darkness. That drama queen. How many times has he stood under that lamp, basking in the light as if he was some kind of chosen one? Like his ego needs that. The man shoved a hand in his pocket, letting the tailored black suit open just so and tilted his head in a rakish pose. Took your time, didn't you? Naruto couldn't stop himself from grinning. Without giving away his movements, he slid the jade disc seamlessly from his pocket to the cup of his hand as he walked. In the next step, Naruto flipped his wrist, flashing the object he'd worked so hard to get, and closed the distance between them. Did you ever doubt me, Dei? A curl of the lips and the man's angelic face turned devilishly handsome. His ice blue eyes flickered with amusement. Never, little fox. Naruto skirted the clogged streets of the night market. At nearly 1 a.m. it still pulsed with sounds, smells and people. Down one edge of the market ran a seedier set of streets, full with the promise of nocturnal activities. Bars, clubs, karaoke joints blared their names from neon signs, and all manner of illicit DVDs and pirated goods were hawked in the roads. Naruto ignored the lights and beckoning calls, and came to a corner where a man was pushing knock-off designer handbags at passers-by. Nailed to the building behind him was a faded, peeling sign for a tea shop. The sign was unremarkable, half hidden by a poster for band that had played a year before, and it pointed down a dark alley that was just as unremarkable. Dark, empty and forgettable. But Naruto turned right for it and, crossing quickly into Cool Alley, the noise of the night market fell away. Naruto's eyes adjusted from the glaring lights to the dim lane. At the end of a long expanse of a brick wall was a single street lamp, lighting a dented old metal door and a short set of steps. The silhouettes of two men melted out of the shadows beyond the door. The tip of a cigarette suddenly burned cherry red in the darkness. He'd been seen. Naruto stepped off the sidewalk and into the middle of the alley, walking toward the circle of light on the ground and letting them get a clear look at him. Satisfied, a thick-armed guy slunk back to the doorway, followed by the sound of scraping stool legs on the concrete. But the smoker stepped forward and waited. Cold light reflected off his long ponytail, making his pale hair almost glow white. Naruto snickered to himself in the darkness. That drama queen. How many times has he stood under that lamp, basking in the light as if he were some kind of chosen one? Like his ego needs that. The man shoved a hand in his pocket, letting the tailored black suit open just so and tilted his head in a rakish pose. Took your time, didn't you? Naruto couldn't stop himself from grinning. Without giving away his movements, he slid the jade disc seamlessly from his pocket to the cup of his hand as he walked. In the next step he flipped his wrist, flashing the object he'd worked so hard to get, and closed the distance between them. Did you ever doubt me, Dei? A curl of the lips and the man's angelic face turned devilishly handsome. His ice blue eyes flickered with amusement. Never, little fox. Naruto smirked at the nickname and shook his head once out of habit. Shaggy yellow hair fell forward and tufted out of the edges of the hood, hiding the whisker-like scars at the edge of his face. Stepping into the light, Naruto extended his hand. In a single handshake the ancient treasure was transferred. It caught the light as it passed, and they paused to look at it with the respect it commanded. The light shining through the disc turned the green areas milky white, and the dragon carving swirling around the hole in the middle came alive, just like the hook he'd stolen the night before. Any trouble this time? But before Dei could finish he caught sight of the bandage on Naruto's forehead. What the? Naruto ducked away from his reach, but he was saved from answering for it by the approach of footsteps. They broke apart. Dei slipped the disc smoothly into his suit pocket, and Naruto angled his head so the shadow of his hood fell over his face. Deidara, a deep voice drawled. Deidara nodded with cool respect at the figure stalking forward out of the dark. Kisame. At the name, Naruto relaxed a notch and glanced over. A big, broad-shouldered man, Kisame nearly filled up the sidewalk. Two curvy women hung on each arm in practiced carelessness, their touch light enough not to leave a wrinkle on his gunmetal gray suit. Kyuubi, he grunted at Naruto. Naruto nodded back, making sure to keep his eyes respectfully locked on Kisame's cold gray ones, never straying to the edge of his full-body tattoo that peeked from his cuffs or collar, or to the rings that fit like brass knuckles when they came together in a line. The girls smiled sweetly, and though Naruto actually knew them from the club, he didn't dare let his eyes stray. Bigger men than him had lost a finger for ogling Kisame's arm candy. Kisame grinned at Naruto's wary behavior. Where Deidara was handsome, Kisame was monstrous. His lips parted to reveal teeth sharpened to vicious points. And when he turned to usher the two girls through the metal door, even the back of him was threatening. The nose of an enormous shark, nearly the same gray color as his suit, surged out of the back of his collar. The tattooed creature rode an inked wave of blue-green water strewn with torn white petals that curled masterfully up over his skull until it faded into his shaved scalp. From the front, only a few licks of water were visible around his neck. From the back, it looked like the open-maw beast was going to lift off and devour anyone who had the misfortune to try to sneak up on the big man. Naruto could never decide if the shark had just finished tearing through something lower down in the tattoo or if it was preparing to devour Kisame himself. From what he knew of the enforcer, and his affinity for sharks, cold-blooded killers who, like Kisame, would destroy their own kind to survive, Naruto thought it could go either way. The hefty bouncer stood and pulled open the door. Smoky air and loud music spilled out, and the girls sashayed into the crimson interior to a chorus of catcalls. They were waving prettily back when the door swung closed behind them. On the steps, Kisame turned back to Deidara. "You coming?" "Yeah," Deidara said, then flicked his cigarette into the gutter where it sizzled out. Kisame's shark eyes slid to Naruto. "Did you get it?" Somehow he made the question sound like a threat. Naruto nodded once. Satisfied, Kisame disappeared into the club, Deidara heading up behind him. But Deidara turned back on the landing, surprised to see Naruto wasn't following him. "The meeting's about to begin. You can wait inside, you know." Naruto shook his head. "I'll just wait out here." "Suit yourself," Deidara said with a shrug. "But don't go anywhere. He wants to see you too. I hear he's got a new gig for you." He narrowed his eyes at Naruto's bandage. "And I still want to know what happened to you." Naruto rolled his eyes and waved him off. The bouncer shut the door behind him, then dropped back to the stool. It creaked under the man's weight, but didn't give way. Naruto sunk his hands deep into his hoodie and leaned against the dark wall, taking Deidara's spot beside the bouncer. In the stillness, the moths returned to the cone of light, circling endlessly. Going nowhere fast. 8 years before, Deidara had brought him to this spot, pointed to the very same street light and said, in that dramatic way that had once intimidated him to his core, that Naruto had a choice. Either come with him, or stay out on the sidewalk and go nowhere. Because there wouldn't be another chance like the one he was offering. Naruto snorted softly at the memory. Drama queen. But the thing was, Deidara had been right. It was his only chance. There was no other choice. As an orphan growing up in Konoha, Naruto knew that better than anyone. "I bet you're too scared." "Shut up. I can do it." Naruto squinted at the apple on the edge of the long plastic table, mustering all the courage he had in his 12-year-old body. It was just sitting there, so perfect. All he had to do was run over and grab it. "I could do it, if I wanted to. But I thought I'd let you have this one. I said I'll do it. Just don't screw it up." "Shut up, Sasuke." Hiding behind empty produce boxes, the black-haired 12-year-old beside him snickered, making the shaggy blonde even more determined to get the apple. Every night, for as long as he could remember, they'd been sneaking out of the orphanage and running down to the night market. They used to just run around, see the sights. But they'd taken to daring each other to perform tasks. It was a game. Like the ninjas in the tattered storybooks from the orphanage, they were on a secret mission. Only the risks kept getting higher. Sasuke was so fast, he could run past a stall and whip a piece of food off the edge without anyone noticing. Sasuke made it look easy. His timing was perfect, and he was so agile and quick that things just worked for him. But not Naruto. He never seemed to catch on as quickly. No matter what he did, Naruto always felt like he was a step behind Sasuke, always a little more clumsy. The last time he rose to one of Sasuke's dares, Naruto swiped a bean cake off a tray, only to run directly into the stout baker that ran the stall. The man easily lifted Naruto up by his shirt collar, shaking him and spitting curses into his face. Naruto couldn't hear them. He was so scared he couldn't hear anything. The man raised his hand and Naruto screwed his eyes shut, cringing against the inevitable crack of a hand across his face. But instead of a smack, something soft and warm bounced off him. Dots of hot, sticky sweetness splashed across his face. It smelled like grape jam. Naruto looked up to see a streak of purple across the livid red face of the baker. Another jelly donut whizzed between them, missing them both, and the man dropped Naruto on his butt. Nato's ears suddenly unclogged. He heard laughter, the thud of another missed donut, then roared threats of the stall owner as he stalked toward the source of the flying donuts. Sasuke's voice rang out above it all, "Get up! Run!" Naruto saw Sasuke across the stall hurling great handfuls of cookies, cakes, anything he could grab to distract the man. "Run!" Naruto shot up, but a crowd of onlookers blocked his exit, so he lunged for the dumpling stall next door, dodging the old cook's weak grab but knocking over the baker's table in the process. Trays of bean cakes went tumbling to the ground. The baker turned back, cursing anew at the crashing sound, and Sasuke took off in the opposite direction, just as the Konoha police were rounding the corner looking for the reported disturbance. When Sasuke finally found Naruto, hiding 2 streets over behind a trash bin, Naruto was still visibly shaken. Sasuke just stood in the middle of the alley, hands on hips, and laughed at him until he'd nearly doubled himself over. A pang of anger rippled through Naruto. This was all Sasuke's fault to begin with, but he was still too worked up to do anything about it. He raked trembling hands through his hair, wiped cold sweat from his brow and glanced nervously up and down the lane. He was sure the baker, the cook, the police, even the rest of the shoppers from the night market were going to pour through that alley at any moment, looking for them. Ever since that night, Naruto held back. He watched Sasuke zip through the stalls, snatching food or cheap trinkets in a whirlwind of speed and pounding feet. But Naruto was cautious. Even taking that apple, so perfectly placed on the corner of the table, glistening red atop the cheap blue tarp that doubled as a tablecloth, could go horribly wrong. From their hiding spot behind a stack of empty fruit crates, Sasuke pointed out that the owner was the perfect target, a stooped old man completely absorbed in sweeping out his stall. But Naruto knew all the old man had to do was turn his head and he could be caught. "Go for it," Sasuke whispered, nudging him hard. "He's got his back turned. Now's your chance." A woman with an empty shopping bag on her shoulder passed in front of them, blocking their view. Naruto chewed his lip, slowly building up his courage. Maybe Sasuke was right. This might be his best chance, especially if the owner was occupied. The woman lingered, looking, then stepped forward into the stall. The owner put aside his broom and she launched into an animated story. Naruto didn't think she was particularly attractive, but it must have been a funny story, because she smiled big and had the shop owner's full attention. Suddenly she opened her arms wide and pointed away to a distant stall where they both looked together. The floppy bag swung out from her hip as she pointed, bumping the edge of the table a few times. But whoever they were looking for was gone. She shrugged, the shopkeeper laughed anyway, and when she turned to leave he bid her a hearty farewell. The man went back to sweeping, moving deeper into the stall with his back fully turned to them, and Naruto had to admit it was an even better opportunity than before to run by and swipe the. But the apple was gone. The corner of the blue tarp sat empty. Naruto sunk back on his heels, blinking in confusion. The opportunity was lost, and he didn't even know when he'd lost it. Sasuke whacked his shoulder. "See, you should have gone earlier when I told you to." Naruto stood and brushed the dirt off his knees. "Doesn't matter. Don't like apples," he said with a harumph. "I like oranges." Sasuke shook his head and followed him out into the open. But around the corner in the next row of stalls they came upon the woman again. She spoke to another shop owner, smiling and pointing away, obviously telling the same story. However, this time when the big bag swung around, Naruto noticed it wasn't so floppy. He put his hand on Sasuke's arm and they stopped. But while Sasuke was distracted by a DVD with buxom smiling girls on the cover, Naruto watched her. She pointed again, squinting into the distance, and in that moment the bag draped open. With her other hand she slid a t-shirt off the edge of the table and into the bag. Naruto's mouth dropped open. If he'd blinked, he would have missed it. Never losing her focus on the shopkeeper, she shrugged, laughed with him about the story, then bid him farewell. But as she walked out she dipped her hand in her bag. Naruto thought she might have had a change of heart and decided to return the shirt to the table, but instead she pulled out a bright red apple, bit into it, and sailed off into the night, smiled broadly. Naruto couldn't believe it. That was his apple, and she'd stolen it right out from underneath all of them. The rest of that night he wandered the market in a trance. His eyes had been opened. That woman hadn't used force or speed. Like the ninjas from his storybooks, she'd used stealth. Her flattering smiles and funny stories had distracted her victims from her real purpose. After that night, Naruto had a new game to try. The night market had always pulled them, even when they were young. Two boys growing up in one of Konoha's orphanages, their world was stale and colorless. Though there was little money, they were still treated kindly, given food and clothes and an education. They followed the rules, did their homework and chores, and were happy to do so. But at night, the lights and sounds and smells of the night market drifted up through their window, teasing them. Even the name it had an allure, the night market. This wasn't the tedium of daytime shopping, where tired people lugged home bags of groceries and necessities under the hot sun. Only the most desirable, coveted items came from the night market. Toys and candies, music CDs and colorful t-shirts. Any trinket worth having came from there, even though the orphanage kids rarely received such luxuries. For young Naruto and Sasuke, whispering under their bedcovers at night, the night market was the stuff of dreams. A place that only came alive at night, while the rest of the orphanage, the rest of Konoha slept. A place where none of the rules applied. They longed to go there, just once, and told each other stories about what they would see, what they would do, and, being growing boys, what they would eat. It wasn't until their 9th summer that they got their first taste of life at the night market. A rusty window screen in the bedroom proved to be the key. Doing their chores one stifling July afternoon, Naruto wiped down the windowsill in the room they shared with the younger boys, only to discover a piece of an old towel shoved under the lock. It was so deep it just looked like another part of the dingy wall. He picked out the wad of fabric and motioned Sasuke over. There, directly under the lock, was a hole in the wall. It looked like it had been scraped out years before. Sasuke just shrugged. Not our fault. Must have been done by some kids before us, 'cause we're the oldest now. Just push it back in. No one will ever know. He fisted the broom handle and was about to step away when Naruto slid his fingers into the gap and pushed the screen out. Both boys' eyes went wide. Peeking out, they saw where previous generations had already flattened a trail down the outside wall. A hand on the ledge, a foot on the gutter, and in 3 easy steps they could be down to the first floor. Water ran down the center of the dark alley below like a silver trail leading away from the old orphanage. Sasuke and Naruto grinned at each other. Naruto gently let the screen fall closed. This was their secret. Late that night, once everyone was asleep, they crept down the side of the building and out into the wide, dark world. They followed the silvery water, aglow with reflected light, away from the orphanage and toward the pulsing sounds and smells of the market. Every night that first summer they explored the market as if they were adventurers in a mythical land. They traced and retraced their routes, learning their way and the ways of the people who shopped there. They were worried at first they'd be caught. But they quickly discovered no one cared about 2 kids darting through the homemade stalls. All the old prejudices still observed during Konoha's daylight hours simply melted away under the hazy night sky. Even the market itself refused to obey the network of streets it was confined to, instead seeping down alleys and around corners so that it overlapped into the other districts. They wandered the market, watching shoppers buying hot meals or popsicles, movies or purses or fancy jackets. Lovers sniffed at bottles of love potions. Old men played games of chance. Teenagers giggled over magazines, and grannies got their feet massaged. Everyone mixed in together. A couple of shabby orphan boys drew no attention at all. In fact, they actually found that they were treated with a measure of respect they'd never known before. In the daylight, walking in long rows on the occasional field trip, shopkeepers and old Konoha citizens cast a wary eye at the kids. As if their status as the lowest of the low in Konoha society was something they might catch. But here, stall keepers smiled and asked if they would like to purchase something. Cooks waved plates of food at them. Florists encouraged them to smell the flowers. Naruto and Sasuke were giddy at the prospect, even if they didn't have a single coin between them. Late one night, Naruto even saw some really important people in the market. A well-dressed man with sleek back hair, a spotless black suit and an impossibly beautiful girl on his arm strode by. While most people nodded respectfully, Naruto stumbled to a stop just to watch the couple pass. He'd never seen more beautiful people in all his life. They looked like they had stepped out of a movie poster. Sasuke didn't seem very impressed. He turned strangely surly at the sight of the man, but Naruto continued to stare. Surely they must be from the biggest, oldest family in all of old Konoha. Seeing that Naruto had drawn the important man's notice with his staring, Sasuke nudged him hard in the ribs. Naruto snapped his mouth shut, bowed his head meekly, and waited for the scowl he'd been used to receiving from the anyone of importance in Konoha. But to Naruto's amazement, instead of being ignored or reviled, the man nodded once in return. A ghost of a smile even played at his lips, which grew wider as Naruto's mouth fell open again. The man continued down the lane, surveying the scene as if he owned it, then turned at the corner. And for one brief moment before the man disappeared, Naruto thought he saw a slip of color at his collar. Just a line, but he couldn't be sure. He watched the empty space, thinking. He'd heard about tattoos from their Okasan, but he'd never actually seen one. As their house mother, she was always warning them to stay away from certain people in life. And the tattooed ones were at the top of the list. Naruto decided it was probably just a shadow, because someone that dressed like that had to be important. Smiling, Naruto shook his head and put the warning out of his mind. The two young best friends explored everything they would outside the orphanage walls. They traversed the city, learning early on that Konoha had many districts. Some for shopping, some for eating. A thriving wharf and a gleaming high street lined with fancy shops. The poorest district on one side of the market, where the buildings were as thick as weeds and people carved out sad lives in the tiny apartment. And on the opposite side, buffered by the market like it was a moat around a fairy tale castle, was the ancient walled city of old Konoha where the old clan homes and temples hid behind elaborate gates. They even ventured inside the walls one night, prowling down the clean streets and feeling distinctly out of place. But once they'd been to the other districts, they didn't need to go back. The night market was their playground. The unbridled freedom kept them coming back night after night. They yawned their way through their daytime lessons and took turns napping instead of doing chores, but once the sun went down, they began to wake up. Going hours each night without eating, however, drove them to think of the necessities alongside the fun. At first it was just a half-rotten food dumped behind a fruit stand, or a stick of skewered meat, the top chunk pulled off before it was discarded outside a food hut. But eventually, they wanted more. Sasuke longed for a fried pie, oozing hot fruit out onto the paper plate, while Naruto practically drooled for the roast duck turning over the grill. It was hard to say no to their growling stomachs when there was so much all around them. And the hungrier they became, the more daring they grew. They hung around the back of the stalls instead of the front, plucking up fresh fruit that had rolled to the ground, bags of chips out of the top of open boxes, and even whole skewers of meat, snatched right off the back of the grill, so hot they had to bounce them from hand to hand as they ran. One time Naruto reached in a bucket expecting mandarins, but instead pulled out his hand with a small lobster-looking creature attached to his thumb. The man chased them down, but Naruto and Sasuke were quicker. They hit a chain link fence and threw themselves over, throbbing thumb and all. Sasuke laughed about that for months afterwards. Those nights were like the dream they'd always imagined it would be. They were young and free and inseparable. And as they grew, so did their adventures. They moved from food to objects. Nothing of much value, just sneaking and pinching what they could. Weird toys, 2 small t-shirts, the odd earring, never a pair. Sasuke was especially good at it. He used his natural speed to snag all manner of items, even moving up to expensive things like CDs and wristwatches. Though they saw people hawking their obviously stolen goods, Naruto and Sasuke never did. Instead, they gave them to other kids in the orphanage or left them in the market before they went home, a treasure for someone else to find. Naruto had kept pace with Sasuke for a while, but after finding that he wasn't as quick as Sasuke, self-doubt held him back. However, once he saw the woman with the floppy bag swipe the apple out from under his nose, Naruto found a new goal. He worked on becoming more like her instead of fast like Sasuke. And over time he grew confident in his ninja game of stealth. Every night Naruto practiced smiling and flattering and stealing. The first time he made a lift, it was just a piece of fruit, just like the woman had. He smiled big and waved hello, inadvertently knocking an apple off the table. But when he moved in time with the shop owner to pick it up, he slid the orange that sat beside it on the table into his pocket. They rose together. He apologized, smiling again, saying he forgot he was out of money. The owner just nodded in understanding and waved him off. 2 rows over, Naruto thought he'd never tasted a sweeter orange. Naruto honed his skill, but instead of moving on to more expensive items, he tasked himself with pulling hard and harder lifts. He went from food and trinkets to slipping billfolds out of purses, then pockets. He kept the money but always pitched the personal effects somewhere they were likely to be found. After all, he wasn't a criminal, he was just after a little bit of spending money. The first few dips didn't net anything, but on his 4th time he got lucky. Someone had a 20. He went a little lightheaded at actually having money in his hand. He'd never had money. Ever. Growing up in the threadbare orphanage, they weren't given any. There wasn't any to give. To Naruto, the crisp bill felt like a holiday in his hand. He could actually buy something. Anything. He saw the night market with fresh eyes. All of the junk, the knockoff clothing, the food stalls, all of it could be theirs. Later, when they passed a pastry stand and the sweet smell of fried pies hit them and Sasuke's stomach growled audibly, Naruto leapt forward with a giant smile. He bought 2 steaming hot pies while Sasuke stared. But his eyes dropped to the bill flashing in Naruto's hand. Naruto handed him the pie, but Sasuke shook his head, pointing instead at the wad of cash. "Where'd you get that?" Naruto straightened with pride. "I got it off some old rich guy who wasn't paying attention." But Sasuke still didn't take the pie. "Don't worry," Naruto said quietly, leading him away from the stand, "I didn't take anything else. And he'll find his wallet if he retraces his steps. It's all good." Naruto grinned and shoved the pie into Sasuke's hand. The scent and heat persuaded him better than Naruto could, and Sasuke finally gave in. They plopped down on the curb and ate, licking the hot fruit syrup off their fingers. The troubling fact of the source of the money was forgotten behind a haze of deliciousness like they'd never had before. From then on, Naruto and Sasuke avoided the one difference they'd ever had. Naruto made sure to split off from Sasuke when he went to follow a possible mark. And Sasuke never asked when Naruto later produced gifts that he'd purchased from the market stalls. Sweets that were once unimaginable, meals they never thought they'd taste, all of it was within their grasp now. And in that harmony, Naruto and Sasuke thrived, tasting a side of life they had never imagined in all their days at the drab orphanage. Those years were brilliant fun. They were together, and nothing could touch them. But at 14, 2 things happened. Not together, in fact, they occurred months apart. But in Naruto's memory, the 2 events were inextricably entwined, as if they happened the very same day. Sasuke was chosen for the academy. And Naruto was marked for the Akatsuki.